Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 595, Etegami. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am tired. I have not slept this week. I don't know why. I think it started with the full moon and it ended with realizing how little time we have left until I am driving Aiden across the country. And that is just weird. So, in dealing with that, what do? I stumble on a really lovely art thing. And why really lovely? Because you don't need any skills. I love it. It's not a skill-free thing. It's kind of a mindfulness thing. And there's all this stuff going around YouTube right now about neurographic art, which is fine. And you can look that up. And some of it's really rather lovely. But Etegami struck me differently. And I'm just going to give you what little I know about where this came from and what it is. And then I'm going to tell you the motto of the guy who came up with this. So this man, Kunio Koike, which I think is how you pronounce it. He's Japanese, not a surprise. He's considered the father of Etegami. He was an artist. He could do the very, very mannered and precise calligraphy, Japanese calligraphy, which both Japanese and Chinese calligraphy requires skill sets that I can only dream of. The amount of precision that's required is just well beyond me. And brush control, really, because the brushes look like, well, in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing, the brushes look like they should all be the answer to the problem. And instead, they bring up a new problem because you really have to know what you're doing in order to make the brush do what you want it to do. However, this guy took the traditional kinds of brushes and held them from the tip. So it's like the brush tip is a pendulum on the paper. So just with the lightest of control, you paint with sumi ink. This is the black, thick, soot dark ink that you see used so beautifully in a lot of Asian art. So you you take that and you draw something small and simple and probably pretty badly, and you let it dry. And then add color. Usually watercolor, doesn't even have to be black sumi ink. It could be anything. But you do it in this kind of unstructured, incredibly loose way. It can't be perfect. There is no hope that it is going to look perfect, which is why it's genius. So he started this in the 60s and it got popularized in the 70s. And some people say that there is this requirement that these pieces of art be done on like postcard sized things and that you then have to send the postcard to someone. And it's a lovely idea and I support it and I will do it. But I think that the have to part might have been glommed on after the fact. I'm not entirely sure. I'm still looking up information on that. But if you do decide to do something like this as part of a mindfulness practice or a writing practice or a happy meal, not happy meal, happy male practice, I think that's lovely. The other thing that I loved about this was his motto, and I am not even going to pretend that I can pronounce it in Japanese, but the way it translates evidently is clumsiness is no problem. Clumsy makes it better. And I thought, well then, that is my kind of art. So I am going to share on the show notes today my very first piece of Etegami art. I did the first one in a notebook, not on a postcard. And you may be saying to yourself, Heather, what kind of postcard am I going to find onto which I could paint something, even if I did have sumi ink or whatever. And again, it doesn't have to be sumi ink. If you're going to use watercolor or gouache, I actually kind of think cheap watercolor set might be a really good idea because that tends to be a little chalkier and, well, cheaper, number one. But I also think that you can just keep mixing more and more water into the little paint pot on the cheap watercolor kits that you can get, like children's watercolor kits. Just keep adding more and more water and mixing and mixing and mixing and get it as thick as you can. You won't feel guilty about wasting paint, and I think you can probably get it pretty thick. If it's not getting thick enough, take one of the dark blues and add that, and then take a dark red and add that, and you can get a really nice, rich, dark, kind of multi-layered black, which could be fun. Heck, I might try that this afternoon. Anyway, you have to let the black ink dry completely or the black paint dry completely, and then watercolor over the top of it. And as you will see in the example that I am going to share, it will bleed. Even with sumi ink, I thought it was completely dry. I actually took a roll of paper towels and rolled them very solidly and with pressure over the top of my black ink. Nothing came off on the very absorbent cotton paper towel. Didn't matter. Ink still bled. I love it. I love it. So I have linked out to a blog post that explains more about it and has a lot. It was the blog post I could find that had the most examples embedded in it. So you can see all sorts of really cool art-ness. And if you're looking for something easy, clumsy, friendly, and one that doesn't require a whole lot of kit to be able to do, I have something for you that you might be able to have a lot of fun with for the summer. As far as the postcards go, and I know I started to say this a little while ago and got distracted, I have found on online stores brown craft paper postcards. You can get 100 of them for almost nothing. And if you have a paper punch that does rounded corners, you can round off the corners and make them, fancy schmancy that way. Or you can get white watercolor paper postcards that come in a tin. I think you get a tin of 24, 25. Hanemule has one set, but I found another little tinned set of 24 at Jerry's Artorama. I love Jerry's Artorama. Online for considerably less money. And the name of the company, or the name that's on the tin anyway, is Reflections. Reflexions. And I actually like the more inexpensive ones better. I found that the paper behaved the way I wanted it to more. And that could just be me. It's all kind of personal to the way that you paint, if you paint. And I hope you paint something goofy like this. So, there. That's my 2 cents. The other thing is my mom is here. Yay! My mom is here and she's knitting. So that's fun. It's fun to see her with her needles a-clickin'. So next week I will be with you, no question. The following week I am not sure. We will be at the beach. And if I can, I will pre-record an episode for you. And that'll come out, I think, on the 1st of July. Holy cow. Things are popping. But if I can't pre-record one and get it to Justin in time, then I may skip July 1st and be back with you the following week. Just so you know. Today we have 3 chapters, chapter 23, 24, and 25 of book the 2nd. The first chapter is very brief. It focuses mostly on the Dauphin being a dope. I know you're shocked. And there's a little bit of confusion, I think, from modern ears that come at the end of chapter 23. There's this whole thing of being elevated. The family of Joan is going to be elevated by the Dauphin because of her. We come into trickiness because we in the West who speak English have called her Joan of Arc for so long. And that's not really her name at all. Her real name was probably Jean Jeanne or Jehanne, something like that. It's the feminine of John or Jean. That part is fine. But the of Arc is probably a misreading of her father's last name, which was most likely Dark, Darc. Spelling wasn't codified and apostrophes weren't used. So Jean d'Arc, Jeanne, D apostrophe ARC, is a modern version in French of what we've started calling her in the last few hundred years. The thing she called herself, more often than not, was La Pucelle, Pucelle, which we've mentioned before. And in fact, Domremy officially changed its name to Domremy La Pucelle, Domremy of the Maid, basically, to reinforce the fact that this is where she's from. Now, there's another problem. There's always more problems. Locally in Domremy, a lot of times the female children kept their mother's surname, but there's no real written record of Joan having taken either of the surnames that her mother was known by, so it just gets to be a real mess. Thus, it is largely easier to just call her Joan of Arc in English because everybody knows what you mean. However, when you are titled, when you are elevated into a higher rank and position in society, your name gets adapted or changed or adjusted. And that is, in fact, what happens. Jeanne d'Arc de Lis, Dulis, like Fleur de Lis, the little lily, the kind of stylized lilies that you see on the French flag. That is the de Lis we're talking about. That's a big deal because if it's on the French flag, it has to do with the king. And Joan is now being directly by name associated by the Dauphin with the Dauphin, which is kind of a big deal to everybody else, not to Joan. Joan was still La Pucelle and continued to be in her own mind the rest of the time. You will hear a little bit more from Tremouille, just to remind you he is the bad guy. He will continue to be a nudge and a pain in our hindquarters. And, yeah. Chapter 24, very short. It's a paladin chapter. Joan's brothers get mentioned. All of that is true. And then chapter 25, he winds up with his progeny tied in with the Bastard of Orleans, and he shows up in and around Joan's story. More politician than soldier, but he comments in, on, and around battle planning and was a supporter of Joan's. So he comes up in chapter 25. Chapter 25 is another one of those, not just moving the chess pieces on the field, but often we don't get to see in any of the books that we have read together. We don't get to see how, why, and when those chess pieces are decided to be moved. This is one where we get to see the conversation happening behind the scenes instead of just the result of the conversation. So that's kind of interesting. And got a couple things to share with you after we listen. So let's not waste our time. Let's move into chapters 23, 24, and 25 of Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, read for us by John Greenman. Here we go.
Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 23, Joan Inspires the Tawdry King. In the earliest dawn of morning, Talbot and his English forces evacuated their bastilles and marched away, not stopping to burn, destroy, or carry off anything, but leaving their fortresses just as they were, provisioned, armed, and equipped for a long siege. It was difficult for the people to believe that this great thing had really happened, that they were actually free once more, and might go and come through any gate they pleased, with none to molest or forbid. That the terrible Talbot, that scourge of the French, that man whose mere name had been able to annul the effectiveness of French armies, was gone, vanished, retreating, driven away by a girl. The city emptied itself. Out of every gate the crowds poured. They swarmed about the English bastilles like an invasion of ants, but noisier than those creatures, and carried off the artillery and stores, then turned all those dozen fortresses into monster bonfires, imitation volcanoes whose lofty columns of thick smoke seemed supporting the arch of the sky. The delight of the children took another form. To some of the younger ones 7 months was a sort of lifetime. They had forgotten what grass was like, and the velvety green meadows seemed paradise to their surprised and happy eyes after the long habit of seeing nothing but dirty lanes and streets. It was a wonder to them, those spacious reaches of open country to run and dance and tumble and frolic in, after their dull and joyless captivity, so they scampered far and wide over the fair regions on both sides of the river, and came back at eventide weary, but laden with flowers and flushed with new health drawn from the fresh country air and the vigorous exercise. After the burnings, the grown folk followed Joan from church to church, and put in the day in thanksgivings for the city's deliverance, and at night they feted her and her generals, and illuminated the town, and high and low gave themselves up to the festivities and rejoicings. By the time the populace were fairly in bed, toward dawn, we were in the saddle and away toward Tours to report to the king. That was a march which would have turned anyone's head but Joan's. We moved between emotional ranks of grateful country people all the way. They crowded about Joan to touch her feet, her horse, her armor, and they even knelt in the road and kissed her horse's hoofprints. The land was full of her praises. The most illustrious chiefs of the church wrote to the king extolling the maid, comparing her to the saints and heroes of the Bible, and warning him not to let unbelief, ingratitude, or other injustice hinder or impair the divine help sent through her. One might think there was a touch of prophecy in that, and we will let it go at that, but to my mind it had its inspiration in those great men's accurate knowledge of the king's trivial and treacherous character. The king had come to Tours to meet Joan. At the present day this poor thing is called Charles the Victorious, on account of victories which other people won for him, but in our time we had a private name for him which described him better, and was sanctified to him by personal deserving, Charles the Base. When we entered the presence he sat throned, with his tinseled snobs and dandies around him. He looked like a forked carrot, so tightly did his clothing fit him from his waist down. He wore shoes with a rope-like pliant toe a foot long that had to be hitched up to the knee to keep it out of the way. He had on a crimson velvet cape that came no lower than his elbows. On his head he had a tall, felt thing like a thimble, with a feather in its jeweled band that stuck up like a pen from an inkhorn, and from under that thimble his bush of stiff hair stuck down to his shoulders, curving outward at the bottom, so that the cap and the hair together made the head like a shuttlecock. All the materials of his dress were rich, and all the colors brilliant. In his lap he cuddled a miniature greyhound that snarled, lifting its lip and showing its white teeth whenever any slight movement disturbed it. The king's dandies were dressed in about the same fashion as himself, and when I remembered that Joan had called the war council of Orleans disguised ladies' maids, it reminded me of people who squander all their money on a trifle, and then haven't anything to invest when they come across a better chance. That name ought to have been saved for these creatures. Joan fell on her knees before the majesty of France and the other frivolous animal in his lap, a sight which it pained me to see. What had that man done for his country or for anybody in it, that she or any other person should kneel to him? But she had just done the only great deed that had been done for France in 50 years, and had consecrated it with the libation of her blood. The positions should have been reversed. However, to be fair, one must grant that Charles acquitted himself very well for the most part on that occasion, very much better than he was in the habit of doing. He passed his pup to a courtier, and took off his cap to Joan as if she had been a queen. Then he stepped from his throne and raised her, and showed quite a spirited and manly joy and gratitude in welcoming her and thanking her for her extraordinary achievement in his service. My prejudices are of a later date than that. If he had continued as he was at that moment, I should not have acquired them. He acted handsomely. He said, "You shall not kneel to me, my matchless general. You have wrought royally, and royal courtesies are your due." Noticing that she was pale, he said, "But you must not stand. You have lost blood for France, and your wound is yet green. Come." He led her to a seat and sat down by her. "Now then, speak out frankly, as to one who owes you much and freely confesses it before all this courtly assemblage. What shall be your reward? Name it." I was ashamed of him, and yet that was not fair, for how could he be expected to know this marvelous child in these few weeks, when we, who thought we had known her all her life, were daily seeing the clouds uncover some new altitudes of her character whose existence was not suspected by us before? But we are all that way. When we know a thing we have only scorn for other people who don't happen to know it, and I was ashamed of these courtiers, too, for the way they licked their chops, so to speak, as envying Joan her great chance, they not knowing her any better than the king did. A blush began to rise in Joan's cheeks at the thought that she was working for her country for pay, and she dropped her head and tried to hide her face, as girls always do when they find themselves blushing. No one knows why they do, but they do, and the more they blush the more they fail to get reconciled to it, and the more they can't bear to have people look at them when they are doing it. The king made it a great deal worse by calling attention to it, which is the unkindest thing a person can do when a girl is blushing. Sometimes, when there is a big crowd of strangers, it is even likely to make her cry if she is as young as Joan was. God knows the reason for this. It is hidden from men. As for me, I would as soon blush as sneeze. In fact, I would rather. However, these meditations are not of consequence. I will go on with what I was saying. The king rallied her for blushing, and this brought up the rest of the blood and turned her face to fire. Then he was sorry, seeing what he had done, and tried to make her comfortable by saying the blush was exceeding becoming to her, and not to mind it, which caused even the dog to notice it now, so of course the red in Joan's face turned to purple, and the tears overflowed and ran down. I could have told anybody that that would happen. The king was distressed, and saw that the best thing to do would be to get away from this subject, so he began to say the finest kind of things about Joan's capture of the Tourelle, and presently, when she was more composed, he mentioned the reward again and pressed her to name it. Everybody listened with anxious interest to hear what her claim was going to be, but when her answer came their faces showed that the thing she asked for was not what they had been expecting. "Oh, dear gracious Dauphin, I have but one desire, only one, if—" "Do not be afraid, my child. Name it." "That you will not delay a day. My army is strong and valiant, and eager to finish its work. March with me to Reims, and receive your crown." You could see the indolent king shrink in his butterfly clothes. "To Reims? Oh, impossible, my general. We march through the heart of England's power?" Could those be French faces there? Not one of them lighted in response to the girl's brave proposition, but all promptly showed satisfaction in the king's objection. Leave this silken idleness for the rude contact of war? None of these butterflies desired that. They passed their jeweled comfit-boxes one to another, and whispered their content in the head butterfly's practical prudence. Joan pleaded with the king, saying, "Ah, I pray you do not throw away this perfect opportunity. Everything is favorable, everything. It is as if the circumstances were specially made for it. The spirits of our army are exalted with victory, those of the English forces depressed by defeat. Delay will change this. Seeing us hesitate to follow up our advantage, our men will wonder, doubt, lose confidence, and the English will wonder, gather courage, and be bold again. Now is the time. Prithee let us march." The king shook his head, and La Tremouille, being asked for an opinion, eagerly furnished it. "Sire, all prudence is against it. Think of the English strongholds along the Loire. Think of those that lie between us and Rheims." He was going on, but Joan cut him short and said, turning to him, "If we wait, they will all be strengthened, reinforced. Will that advantage us?" "Why, no." "Then What is your suggestion? What is it that you would propose to do? My judgment is to wait. Wait for what? The minister was obliged to hesitate, for he knew of no explanation that would sound well. Moreover, he was not used to being catechized in this fashion, with the eyes of a crowd of people on him, so he was irritated, and said, "Matters of state are not proper matters for public discussion." Joan said placidly, "I have to beg your pardon. My trespass came of ignorance. I did not know that matters connected with your department of the government were matters of state." The minister lifted his brows in amused surprise, and said, with a touch of sarcasm, "I am the King's chief minister, and yet you had the impression that matters connected with my department are not matters of state? Pray, how is that?" Joan replied indifferently, "Because there is no state." "No state?" "No, sir, there is no state, no use for a minister. France is shrunk to a couple of acres of ground. A sheriff's constable could take care of it. Its affairs are not matters of state. The term is too large." The King did not blush, but burst into a hearty, careless laugh, and the court laughed too, but prudently turned its head and did it silently. La Tremouille was angry, and opened his mouth to speak, but the King put up his hand and said, "There, I take her under the royal protection. She has spoken the truth, the ungilded truth. How seldom I hear it! With all this tinsel on me and all this tinsel about me, I am but a sheriff after all, a poor shabby 2-acre sheriff, and you are but a constable." And he laughed his cordial laugh again. "Joan, my frank, honest general, will you name your reward? I would ennoble you. You shall quarter the crown and the lilies of France for a blazon, and with them your victorious sword to defend them. Speak the word." It made an eager buzz of surprise and envy in the assemblage, but Joan shook her head and said, "Ah, I cannot, dear and noble Dauphin. To be allowed to work for France, to spend one's self for France, is itself so supreme a reward that nothing can add to it, nothing. Give me the one reward I ask, the dearest of all rewards, the highest in your gift. March with me to Reims and receive your crown. I will beg it on my knees." But the King put his hand on her arm, and there was a really brave awakening in his voice and a manly fire in his eye when he said, "No, sit. You have conquered me. It shall be as you—" But a warning sign from his minister halted him, and he added, to the relief of the court, "Well, we will think of it. We will think it over and see. Does that content you, impulsive little soldier?" The first part of the speech sent a glow of delight to Joan's face, but the end of it quenched it, and she looked sad, and the tears gathered in her eyes. After a moment she spoke out with what seemed a sort of terrified impulse, and said, "Oh, use me, I beseech you, use me. There is but little time." "But little time?" "Only a year. I shall last only a year." "Why, child, there are 50 good years in that compact little body yet." "Oh, you err. Indeed you do. In one little year the end will come. Ah, the time is so short, so short. The moments are flying, and so much to be done. Oh, use me, and quickly. It is life or death for France." Even those insects were sobered by her impassioned words. The King looked very grave, grave and strongly impressed. His eyes lit suddenly with an eloquent fire, and he rose and drew his sword and raised it aloft. Then he brought it slowly down upon Joan's shoulder and said, "Ah, thou art so simple, so true, so great, so noble, and by this accolade I join thee to the nobility of France, thy fitting place, and for thy sake I do hereby ennoble all thy family and all thy kin, and all their descendants born in wedlock, not only in the male, but also in the female line, and more, to distinguish thy house and honor it above all others, we add a privilege never accorded to any before in the history of these dominions. The females of thy line shall have and hold the right to ennoble their husbands when these shall be of inferior degree." Astonishment and envy flared up in every countenance when the words were uttered which conferred this extraordinary grace. The king paused and looked around upon these signs with quite evident satisfaction. "Rise, Joan of Arc, now and henceforth surnamed Du Lis, in grateful acknowledgment of the good blow which you have struck for the lilies of France, and they, and the royal crown, and your own victorious sword, fit and fair company for each other, shall be grouped in your escutcheon and be and remain the symbol of your high nobility forever." As my Lady Du Lis rose, the gilded children of privilege pressed forward to welcome her to their sacred ranks and call her by her new name. But she was troubled, and said these honors were not meet for one of her lowly birth and station, and by their kind grace she would remain simple Joan of Arc, nothing more, and so be called. Nothing more! As if there could be anything more, anything higher, anything greater. My Lady Du Lis, why, it was tinsel, petty, perishable. But Joan of Arc, the mere sound of it sets one's pulses leaping. End of chapter 23. Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 24, Tinsel Trappings of Nobility. It was vexatious to see what a to-do the whole town, and next the whole country, made over the news. Joan of Arc ennobled by the king. People went dizzy with wonder and delight over it. You cannot imagine how she was gaped at, stared at, envied. Why, one would have supposed that some great and fortunate thing had happened to her, but we did not think any great things of it. To our minds no mere human hand could add a glory to Joan of Arc. To us she was the sun soaring in the heavens, and her new nobility a candle atop of it. To us it was swallowed up and lost in her own light. And she was as indifferent to it and as unconscious of it as the other son would have been. But it was different with her brothers. They were proud and happy in their new dignity, which was quite natural, and Joan was glad it had been conferred when she saw how pleased they were. It was a clever thought in the king to outflank her scruples by marching on them under shelter of her love for her family and her kin. Jean and Pierre sported their coat of arms right away, and their society was courted by everybody, the nobles and commons alike. The standard-bearer said, with some touch of bitterness, that he could see that they just felt good to be alive, they were so soaked with the comfort of their glory, and didn't like to sleep at all because when they were asleep they didn't know they were noble. And so sleep was a clean loss of time. And then he said, "They can't take precedence of me in military functions and state ceremonies, but when it comes to civil ones and society affairs, I judge they'll cuddle coolly in behind you and the knights, and Noel and I will have to walk behind them, hey?" "Yes," I said, "I think you are right." "I was just afraid of it, just afraid of it," said the standard-bearer with a sigh. "Afraid of it? I'm talking like a fool. Of course I knew it. Yes, I was talking like a fool." Noel Rainguesson said musingly, "Yes, I noticed something natural about the tone of it." We others laughed. "Oh, you did you? You think you are very clever, don't you? I'll take and wring your neck for you one of these days, Noel Rainguesson." The Sieur de Metz said, "Paladin, your fears haven't reached the top notch. They are away below the grand possibilities. Didn't it occur to you that in civil and society functions they will take precedence of all the rest of the personal staff, every one of us? Oh, come! You'll find it so. Look at their escutcheon. Its chiefest feature is the lilies of France. It's royal, man, royal. Do you understand the size of that? The lilies are there by authority of the king. Do you understand the size of that? Though not in detail and in entirety, they do nevertheless substantially quarter the arms of France in their coat. Imagine it. Consider it. Measure the magnitude of it. We walk in front of those boys? Bless you, we've done that for the last time. In my opinion, there isn't a lay lord in this whole region that can walk in front of them, except the Duc d'Alençon, Prince of the Blood." You could have knocked the Paladin down with a feather. He seemed to actually turn pale. He worked his lips a moment without getting anything out, and then it came. "Well, I didn't know that, nor the half of it. How could I? I've been an idiot. I see it now. I've been an idiot. I met them this morning and sung out hello to them just as I would to anybody. I didn't mean to be ill-mannered, but I didn't know the half of this that you've been telling. I've been an ass. Yes, that is all there is to it. I've been an ass." Noel Rainguesson said, in a kind of weary way, "Yes, that is likely enough, but I don't see why you should seem surprised at it." "You don't you? Well, why don't you?" "Because I don't see any novelty about it. With some people it is a condition which is present all the time. Now you take a condition which is present all the time, and the results of that condition will be uniform. This uniformity of result will in time become monotonous. Monotonousness, by the law of its being, is fatiguing. If you had manifested fatigue upon noticing that you had been an ass, that would have been logical, that would have been rational. Whereas it seems to me that to manifest surprise was to be again an ass, because the condition of intellect that can enable a person to be surprised and stirred by inert monotonousness is— "Now that is enough, Noel Rainguesson. Stop where you are, before you get yourself into trouble. And don't bother me any more for some days or a week, an it please you, for I cannot abide your clack." "Come, I like that. I didn't want to talk. I tried to get out of talking. If you didn't want to hear my clack, what did you keep intruding your conversation on me for?" "I never dreamed of such a thing." "Well, you did it anyway, and I have a right to feel hurt, and I do feel hurt, to have you treat me so. It seems to me that when a person goads and crowds, and in a manner forces another person to talk, it is neither very fair nor very good-mannered to call what he says clack." "Oh, snuffle do, and break your heart, you poor thing. Somebody fetch this sick doll a sugar rag. Look you, Sir John de Metz, do you feel absolutely certain about that thing?" "What thing?" "Why, that Jean and Pierre are going to take precedence of all the lay noblesse hereabouts, except the Duc d'Alençon." "I think there is not a doubt of it." The Standard-Bearer was deep in thoughts and dreams a few moments. Then the silk and velvet expanse of his vast breast rose and fell with a sigh, and he said, "Dear, dear, what a lift it is! It just shows what luck can do. Well, I don't care. I shouldn't care to be a painted accident. I shouldn't value it. I am prouder to have climbed up to where I am just by sheer natural merit than I would be to ride the very sun in the zenith and have to reflect that I was nothing but a poor little accident, and got shot up there out of somebody else's catapult. To me, merit is everything, in fact, the only thing. All else is dross." Just then the bugles blew the assembly, and that cut our talk short. End of chapter 24. Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 25, At Last, Forward. The days began to waste away, and nothing decided, nothing done. The army was full of zeal, but it was also hungry. It got no pay. The treasury was getting empty. It was becoming impossible to feed it. Under pressure of privation it began to fall apart and disperse, which pleased the trifling court exceedingly. Joan's distress was pitiful to see. She was obliged to stand helpless while her victorious army dissolved away until hardly the skeleton of it was left. At last one day she went to the castle of Loch, where the king was idling. She found him consulting with three of his counselors: Robert le Masson, a former chancellor of France, Christophe d'Harcourt, and Gérard Machet. The bastard of Orleans was present also, and it is through him that we know what happened. Joan threw herself at the king's feet and embraced his knees, saying, "Noble Dauphin, prithee hold no more of these long and numerous councils, but come, and come quickly to Reims and receive your crown." Christophe d'Harcourt asked, "Is it your voices that command you to say that to the king?" "Yes, and urgently." "Then will you not tell us in the king's presence in what way the voices communicate with you?" It was another sly attempt to trap Joan into indiscreet admissions and dangerous pretensions, but nothing came of it. Joan's answer was simple and straightforward, and the smooth bishop was not able to find any fault with it. She said that when she met with people who doubted the truth of her mission, she went aside and prayed, complaining of the distrust of these, and then the comforting voices were heard at her ears saying, soft and low, "Go forward, daughter of God, and I will help thee." Then she added, "When I hear that, the joy in my heart, oh, it is insupportable." The Bastard said that when she said these words her face lit up as with a flame, and she was like one in an ecstasy. Joan pleaded, persuaded, reasoned, gaining ground little by little, but opposed step by step by the council. She begged, she implored leave to march, but when they could answer nothing further, they granted that perhaps it had been a mistake to let the army waste away, but how could we help it now? How could we march without an army? "Raise one," said Joan. "But it will take 6 weeks." "No matter, begin, let us begin." "It is too late. Without doubt the Duke of Bedford has been gathering troops to push to the succor of his strongholds on the Loire." "Yes, while we have been disbanding ours, and pity 'tis. But we must throw away no more time, we must bestir ourselves." The king objected that he could not venture toward Rheims with those strong places on the Loire in his path, but Joan said, "We will break them up, then you can march." With that plan the king was willing to venture assent. He could sit around out of danger while the road was being cleared. Joan came back in great spirits. Straightway everything was stirring. Proclamations were issued calling for men, a recruiting camp was established at Celle in Berry, and the commons and the nobles began to flock to it with enthusiasm. A deal of the month of May had been wasted, and yet by the 6th of June Joan had swept together a new army and was ready to march. She had 8,000 men. Think of that! Think of gathering together such a body as that in that little region. And these were veteran soldiers, too. In fact, most of the men in France were soldiers, when you came to that, for the wars had lasted generations now. Yes, most Frenchmen were soldiers, and admirable runners, too, both by practice and inheritance. They had done next to nothing but run for near a century. But that was not their fault. They had had no fair and proper leadership, at least leaders with a fair and proper chance. Away back, king and court got the habit of being treacherous to the leaders. Then the leaders easily got the habit of disobeying the king and going their own way, each for himself and nobody for the lot. Nobody could win victories that way, hence running became the habit of the French troops, and no wonder. Yet all that those troops needed in order to be good fighters was a leader who would attend strictly to business, a leader with all authority in his hands, in place of a tenth of it, along with 9 other generals equipped with an equal tenth apiece. They had a leader rightly clothed with authority now, and with a head and heart bent on war with the most intensely businesslike and earnest sort. And there would be results, no doubt of that. They had Joan of Arc, and under that leadership their legs would lose the art and mystery of running. Yes, Joan was in great spirits. She was here and there and everywhere, all over the camp, by day and by night, pushing things. And wherever she came charging down the lines, reviewing the troops, it was good to hear them break out and cheer. And nobody could help cheering, she was such a vision of young bloom and beauty and grace, and such an incarnation of pluck and life and go. She was growing more and more ideally beautiful every day, as was plain to be seen, and these were days of development, for she was well past 17 now. In fact, she was getting close upon 17 and a half. Indeed, just a little woman, as you may say. The 2 young Counts de Laval arrived one day, fine young fellows, allied to the greatest and most illustrious houses of France, and they could not rest till they had seen Joan of Arc. So the king sent for them and presented them to her, and you may believe she filled the bill of their expectations. When they heard that rich voice of hers, they must have thought it was a flute. And when they saw her deep eyes and her face, and the soul that looked out of that face, you could see that the sight of her stirred them like a poem, like lofty eloquence, like martial music. One of them wrote home to his people, and in his letter he said, "It seemed something divine to see her and hear her." Ah, yes, it was a true word. Truer word was never spoken. He saw her when she was ready to begin her march and open the campaign, and this is what he said about it. She was clothed all in white armor save her head, and in her hand she carried a little battle-axe, and when she was ready to mount her great black horse, he reared and plunged and would not let her. Then she said, "Lead him to the cross." This cross was in front of the church close by, so they led him there. Then she mounted, and he never budged, any more than if he had been tied. Then she turned toward the door of the church and said in her soft, womanly voice, "You priests and people of the church, make processions and pray to God for us." Then she spurred away under her standard, with her little axe in her hand, crying, "Forward! March!" One of her brothers, who came 8 days ago, departed with her, and he also was clad all in white armor. I was there, and I saw it too, saw it all just as he pictures it. And I see it yet, the little battle-axe, the dainty plumed cap, the white armor, all in the soft June afternoon. I see it just as if it were yesterday, and I rode with the staff, the personal staff, the staff of Joan of Arc. That young count was dying to go too, but the king held him back for the present. But Joan had made him a promise. In his letter he said, "She told me that when the king starts for Rheims I shall go with him, but God grant I may not have to wait till then, but may have a part in the battles." She made him that promise when she was taking leave of my lady the Duchess d'Alençon. The Duchess was exacting a promise, so it seemed a proper time for others to do the like. The Duchess was troubled for her husband, for she foresaw desperate fighting, and she held Joan to her breast and stroked her hair lovingly, and said, "You must watch over him, dear, and take care of him, and send him back to me safe. I require it of you. I will not let you go till you promise." Joan said, "I give you the promise with all my heart, and it is not just words, it is a promise. You shall have him back without a hurt. Do you believe? And are you satisfied with me now?" The Duchess could not speak, but she kissed Joan on the forehead, and so they parted. We left on the 6th and stopped over at Romorantin. Then on the 9th Joan entered Orleans in state, under triumphal arches, with the welcoming cannon thundering and seas of welcoming flags fluttering in the breeze. The grand staff rode with her, clothed in shining splendors of costume and decorations. The Duc d'Alençon, the Bastard of Orleans, the Sire de Boussac, Marshal of France, the Lord de Granville, Master of the Crossbowmen, the Sire de Coulon, Admiral of France, Ambroise de Lor, Etienne de Vignolles, called La Hire, Gautier de Broussac, and other illustrious captains. It was grand times, the usual shoutings and packed multitudes, the usual crush to get sight of Joan. But at last we crowded through to our old lodgings, and I saw old Boucher and the wife, and that dear Catherine, gather Joan to their hearts and smother her with kisses, and my heart ached for her so, for I could have kissed Catherine better than anybody, and more and longer, yet was not thought of for that office, and I so famished for it. Ah, she was so beautiful and so sweet! I had loved her the first day I ever saw her, and from that day forth she was sacred to me. I have carried her image in my heart for 63 years, all lonely there, yes, solitary, for it never has had company. And I am grown so old, but it is as fresh and young and merry and mischievous and lovely and sweet and pure and witching and divine as it was when it crept in there, bringing benediction and peace to its habitation so long ago, for it has not aged a day.
Okay, so I don't know if you caught that, but at the beginning of chapter 25, when everybody's like, oh, we have no army, oh, they've all left us, well, I guess we just can't do any of the dangerous stuff, can we? One of the complications that's noted is it will take 6 weeks to put an army together, at least 6 weeks to get them all back. And Joan's like, yes, right, so let's go, guys, now, rah. And blah, 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 blah. The guys, blah, blah, blah. Joan gets her act together. Duh. And By the 6th of June, she had raised an army of 8,000. Now, the battle for Orléans is May 8th. That's when we get Orléans back. And by June 6th, by the time they're having this conversation, it'll take 6 weeks. We could only be 2 or 3 weeks away from June 6th at that point. So in half the time, Joan gets more men than they had before. That's pretty awesome. And how does Joan accomplish this? On the official side of things, because the Dauphin is more than happy to just sit there and let other people mop up the dangerous bits on the road in front of him so that he can just trip merrily down the path after people have gotten rid of all of the dangerous elements for him. I know I always want him to be better than he is, and every once in a while there's something about him that I go, oh, he couldn't have been that bad. Oh, no, maybe he was. So that's unfortunate. And yet the chapter does end on kind of a melancholy note, even though Joan did this amazing thing of getting the army together again. And it's one of those moments where I think we're seeing probably more Twain than anything else, because Louis de Camp is not talking about Joan and being kind of melancholy for Joan and the beauty of her. He's talking about the girl that he had his crush on, Catherine, Joan's good friend. But that whole last bit, I had loved her the first day I ever saw her, and from that day forth she was sacred to me. I've carried her image in my heart for 63 years now, all lonely. Yes, solitary, for it never has had company. And I'm grown old, so old. But it is as fresh and young and merry and mischievous and lovely and sweet and pure and witching and divine as it was when it crept in there. Catherine's beauty is all of those things. As it was when it crept in there, bringing benediction and peace to its habitation so long ago, for it has not aged a day. There's that melancholy of nothing ever came of it, but because nothing ever came of it, it will never get old, get tarnished, change. It will always be this perfect, this platonic ideal of a beauty, and certainly something to look back on when you're getting up there in age and you're not doing as much as you did. And so, yeah, it ends on that melancholy note. But next week, we move, get on the road, hit the road again with Joan. So that's it for me for this week. I hope you are well. Please be safe, be healthy, be happy, wear a mask, take care of yourself, take care of others, and I'll talk to you soon. All right, take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.